Good evening, and thank you for joining us for tonight's Vail Symposium program, Imagining Freedom, Timothy Standring curates Norman Rockwell. Our programming would not be possible were it not for the incredible speakers who bring their expertise to our valley. Without you, our audience, and without our donors, in particular, the Gates Family Foundation, Dale and Jeannie Mosier, the town of Vail, Vail Resort's Epic Promise, the Vail Daily, and the Antlers at Vail. I'd also like to thank our underwriter for this evening, Mary Ellen Anderson, as well as the Claggett Ray Gallery, who we're doing this in partnership with. And a special thanks to Joe Kania. Joe is our cameraman this evening, and he's with Fully Committed Films, and we would not be able to do this live stream tonight or last week's on Ukraine without Joe. Following our speaker's presentation this evening, we will entertain questions from our audience. In order to ask a question, please submit your question in the comments section that's accompanying this video. Tonight's speaker is the Gates Family Foundation Curator at the Denver Art Museum. In this role, he has brought, over the course of the last decade, many blockbuster exhibits, including Van Gogh and Rembrandt. Please help me welcome Timothy Standring.
Great, thank you, Claire. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to contribute to the Vail Symposium, which I'm a great supporter of, and I hope all of you are, and thank you for signing into this. My job tonight is to give you as much misinformation about Norman Rockwell as possible. I hope you all have a sense of humor tonight, notwithstanding market forces, notwithstanding health forces, but a little mirth. And I think Norman himself would probably encourage me to take the same kind of levity in my brief remarks. What I'm going to do is give you a sampler about Norman Rockwell's paintings. And it's a 3 or 4 part section in my lecture in which I'm going to talk about Norman Rockwell himself. I'm going to talk about the 4 freedoms. I'm going to talk a little bit about his social work after he switched from the Saturday Evening Post over to Look magazine, and also encourage you all to go to the Denver Art Museum from May 2nd to August 23rd for this exhibition. Why did we call it Imagining Freedom? Because I think that's at the heart of Norman Rockwell's paintings. Here are the 4 freedoms down below, and up above is a painting, Right to Know. And up in the right-hand corner of the horizontal painting, actually that's a view of how the billboard's going to look when you come up the stairway at the Denver Art Museum. You'll be able to see Norman Rockwell himself at the very right-hand side. But down below is the heart of our story, which is freedom of want, freedom of fear, freedom of speech, and freedom of religion. All of these were expounded by FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, in 1941. Let's talk a little bit about Norman Rockwell. At the press club in the 1960s, he said, I'm actually not George Lincoln Rockwell, who was head of the American Nazi Party, and I'm not Rockwell Kent. I'm actually Norman Rockwell. And during his lifetime, he was actually confused with those other characters. There was a great movie director in Hollywood where he sent a message to Norman Rockwell and said, I'd love to see you, I'd love to see you. So Norman Rockwell went over to the filming studio and went to this very famous producer, and he said, you're not Rockwell Kent. But anyway, Norman Rockwell was a storyteller, and that's my job tonight, is to tell you stories about Norman Rockwell. Lived from 1894 to 1978. He produced 323 covers for the Saturday Evening Post from 1916 to 1963. He was, let me get here. He's most famous because of the Saturday Evening Post covers. He always said that he was an illustrator instead of an artist. And it really wasn't until actually in the 1960s when Harry Abrams published this gigantic, one critic called it, it's not a coffee table book, it's actually the table itself. It was so large. All you need is 4 legs to place it on. It was about 1.5 feet by 1 foot, and it sold about 200,000 copies and made Abrams about $500,000. And Norman Rockwell didn't even take any commissions, any royalties from publication of that book. But the reason why I mention that is because it was entitled Norman Rockwell, Artist and Illustrator. There's a fundamental issue about Norman Rockwell, and that is that he was trained to be a formal artist. He went to the Art Student League in New York City, and he actually took classes from Ernst Blumenschein of the Tao School in illustration, but then soon abandoned that from about 1911 to 1912, 1913. He lived in New Rochelle, lived in Manhattan, New Rochelle, and actually for a time he spent in Remington's studio. But when Norman Rockwell was coming and he published his first cover in 1916, he was in Remington's studio in New Rochelle. But this is the time when a number of those illustrators, such as Howard Pyle, Homer, as well as others, were dying off. And it's a time when Norman Rockwell was coming of age, which was then an age when abstract expressionism was much more important than showing the authenticity of an artist, and that realism was very much of the rear guard. In other words, he was criticized for his realism during his lifetime, and he was scathingly condemned. Now, but let's go back to that slide. Can we go? I'm sorry, we'll have to coordinate here. Can we go back 2 slides, Joe?
You can go back.
Oh, that's right. Okay, there we go. This is Norman Rockwell, who posed himself for a painting, and then on the far side is actually some of our notes of our team as we put together exhibitions and figure it out. And what you're going to see at the Denver Art Museum is not only snippets of biography of Norman Rockwell, but also a little bit about the history of illustration in America, how he came out of the golden age of illustration, then went on to become this very famous illustrator for covers of the Saturday Evening Post, went on to produce these 4 Freedoms, and then went on to other aspects of his career. Let's move on here. Isn't it interesting that the market also disagrees with critics? It wasn't until 1973 when Peter Schjeldahl wrote a review of the only monographic exhibition. Well, there was actually 2 monographic exhibitions of Norman Rockwell. One in 1955 that was at the Corcoran, but that was basically put together by Curtis Publishing Company. But then there was another one at the Brooklyn Art Museum, Brooklyn Museum of Art, in 1972 that then traveled to 9 venues all across America. And it was Schjeldahl who basically said that what's not to like with Norman Rockwell? This guy is absolutely incredibly authentic, even though he uses photographs, which I'm going to show you in this subsequently in this lecture. Rockwell was actually an incredible asset to American art history and to the canon of American art history. I've always loved Norman Rockwell because he's a storyteller. He's not far from the field that I actually make my professional scholarly career in 17th century Italian painting. It's very easy for me to go from Caravaggio all the way over to Norman Rockwell because he's telling stories. The difference is that Caravaggio is basing something on texts and literature, whereas Norman Rockwell, it comes from his imagination. So a painting on the far side saying grace made a world record for Norman Rockwell painting in 2013, $46 million. The painting on the near side over here, Breaking Away, Going Away from Home, sold in 2006 for $15.4 million. So it's interesting that somebody's understanding the merits and the genius of what Rockwell is all about. And his genius is that his stories come from his imagination, not necessarily from other stories. So let's move on here. Two self-portraits, one in 1938, the other one in 1961. The one on the right-hand side, the viewer's right-hand side, would be a triple portrait, and the other one is 1938, shortly when he's just about ready to use photography for his images. Deborah Solomon likes to include a lot of Freudian interpretation into his images, and she suggested that there may be some subliminal issue on the far side with the horseshoe and the Kachina doll at the top of the easel that may allude to a lost child that he and his second wife, Mary, had. Let's move to this. Sorry. Yeah, next one. Sorry. If you can enlarge this on your screen, but the important thing why I wanted to show this detail is when I recently was in Stockbridge this past September, I went to the museum and photographed a number of the paintings there, and I took this detail, and what he pinned up next to the easel is a self-portraits of other artists. For example, Albert Dürer, Rembrandt, Picasso, it's a funny self-portrait, as well as Van Gogh. But the other thing about it, you can see the texture in which he's beginning to use his brush on top of a charcoal drawing on top of the canvas, and you can begin to see the texture of that surface. Now let's go back to Peter Schjeldahl. He went to de Kooning Studio out on Long Island, and he's walking around the gallery, his studio, and he looks at a book, and it's Norman Rockwell. And he goes to Willem de Kooning and says, "Norman Rockwell?" And de Kooning said, "Absolutely." And he opened up a page, and he showed him the texture of painting, of the surfaces of Norman Rockwell's paintings. And he said, he is as good as us. He's an incredible painter. In fact, if you go to a painting, let's go to the next one, right here, called the Connoisseur, in which the man is standing in front of this Jackson Pollock. He said he was better than Jackson in his dripping. So this shows you the range of Norman Rockwell on the left-hand side of 1916, his very first cover. And when they made that color, they didn't have 4-color screening. They only had 2 colors, which was black and red. And so the black and the red creates those browns as well as those grays, and that's what he had to deal with. And right after he got that cover, he decided to get married. He had 3 wives, 1916, 1930, and 1960. And he, beneath this facade, let's go to the next 2. Yes. Okay, so beneath the facade of doing these Americana images of New England, he moved to Arlington, Vermont in about 1938. And he began to assimilate a New England demeanor and depicting all of his townspeople surrounding him, the country doctor, the ice cream parlor, the drugstore, you name it, travelers who are exhausted. This is 1930, Saturday Evening Post, and the barber shop, another one from 1931, I guess. And then the marble champion up above was his first painting that he did in Vermont, and right below was a 1938 ad for Coca-Cola. Here's the problem with Rockwell. He had this tension between advertising as well as producing covers for Saturday Evening Post. And even though advertisement paid more, he much preferred to do the illustrations, in that all of the things that you're looking at were based on Norman Rockwell's imagination as to how. And so he was a great choreographer, and this is just to show you, some of us out in the West don't know where Arlington, Vermont is. We think it's some other state or outside of, in Virginia, but actually it's right above Williamstown is in the middle, and you go through Arlington on Highway 7 and head down to Stockbridge. Why did he move down to Stockbridge? Because his wife, Mary, was undergoing psychiatric treatment at the Austin Riggs Center in Stockbridge, which was enormously famous. In fact, in 1959, who was Norman's therapist? But the person who initiated the story about the identity crisis, who was Erik Erikson. A lot of people don't know this. So we have an individual who hid behind the facade of these stories, but he said that storytelling was really something that could help with despair and really help succor a broad mass appeal. There were millions who knew about Norman Rockwell's images, but only few had ever seen an original. When I went to the museum, I asked them, what's the most common question that you have here? I asked their docents. And the head of the docents said, a lot of people ask, did the Saturday Evening Post come first and then the painting? No, actually it's the painting first. And that slide that we showed him carrying his painting was simply to give you an indication that what would happen is that he would drive to Albany and he would take the train all the way down to New York and then change in New York City, go down to Philadelphia to bring his paintings to Curtis Publishing. Now, the Saturday Evening Post never arrived on Saturday, it arrived on Thursday. And in the early stages, when it was started in 1897, Curtis Publishing was a behemoth, an absolute behemoth. And they gave you the indication that it was actually founded by Ben Franklin, which it wasn't. It was simply printed in the same area where Ben Franklin printed his materials. It sold for 5 cents. It originally was delivered by paperboys or Saturday Evening Post people, and they would get 2 cents for each 5 cents that they would receive. At the time of its height, it was selling close to 3.5 million subscriptions, until it made a major mistake by one of its editors, and it published around 1942 in March an article which was called "The Case Against the Jews." And that caused a great abandonment of subscriptions. And so when Norman Rockwell came to Philadelphia after being rejected by Washington for his 4 freedoms, the editor, Ben Hibbs, said, yes, I'd very much love to do your 4 freedom images, combine them with essays, and publish them in the Saturday Evening Post to bring up the circulation of the magazine. Let's go to the next. That's Mary Barstow, his second wife. That's Eric Erickson with Norman. Let's go to the next. This is a bolopticon. It's basically an optical, it's a device to illustrate something through optics. So this was actually used by Vermeer. It was actually used by Canaletto. It was actually used, these devices, these optical devices for illuminating something which you could draw on a screen, was used by Degas, by Manet, by many others. And actually what's interesting is the time when Rockwell began to receive information, acknowledgement with the photorealists such as Estes. Richard Estes said, Norman is very much like me. We both use photographs like a sketchbook. And in fact, Norman Rockwell said, you know, I feel a little bit guilty, but not so. He was simply pragmatic and very much efficient. He didn't copy photographs. He used them to get the right kind of emotions and the right kind of aspects that he wanted to depict to tell his visual images in his stories. So he was an illustrator who used high art, whereas Andy Warhol, for example, was a commercial artist that made his commercial art into a high art, just the opposite. So here he is using one of those projectors, and on the far side is his studio in Stockbridge. Let's go to the next. And I'm going to run through a couple of slides here which show you how much he would choreograph his images. He would sometimes use up to 100 photographs to bring up a complete composition as he's putting this together in his paintings. And this is called the War News of 1944. Let's go to the next. This is called Tattoo Artist, which is 1944 as well. It was purchased, in fact, in 1970 by the Brooklyn Museum of Art, right before they put together this traveling exhibition. In fact, the irony as well is that the exhibition, the major exhibition of Norman Rockwell, was not supported by Norman. It was simply put together by his dealer. Let's go to the next. This is called the Armchair General. The 3 stars indicates that he has 3 sons in the service. Their photographs are right there next to the 3 stars. In the background is MacArthur as well as Eisenhower. A map on the back, maps on his lap, as well as newspapers. He's trying to understand what's going on with the war effort. And you can see how Norman had taken this photograph and had set it out. Let's go to the next one. But he didn't use photographs all the time. Okay, Isaiah on the far side comes from Michelangelo's Sistine Ceiling of 1509. He doesn't have a lunchbox like Rosie has one. His foot is not on top of Hitler's Mein Kampf. It's an incredible work which sold as well for a record, and it comes from Crystal Bridges, and we're so thrilled that they were kind enough to add it to our exhibition for our venue in Denver. Let's go to the next. And this one is back to Civies in 1945, again showing the photograph of a farm family, a young man from a farm family nearby. Rockwell was able to convince them to model for him for this. He was an actual airman, which shows on the, let me see, the little luggage on the far side in the painting, on the left-hand side. And you can see how he had grown during the war. Let's go to the next 2. And then again, how he had staged this for saying grace. In fact, in 1955, I keep calling it the Denver Post. It's not the Denver Post, it's the Saturday Evening Post, okay? It's not the Post. Anyway, the Saturday Evening Post asked all of its readers and said, what is the most popular image? And they voted Saying Grace, #1. And #2 was Breaking Away, that other picture which I had showed you earlier. But Saying Grace, what he did is he traveled to Albany, went to the train station. That wasn't sufficient enough. He went to Manhattan to look at a train station. And finally, he went back into Arlington, Vermont, and he had an automat in Manhattan send up all the furniture so that he could place his individuals in this composition. The young man with the fag, the cigarette in his mouth, is his son Jarvis, who was known as Jerry, and another individual from the town in this wonderful painting. Let's go to the next. And this one, isn't it interesting, the choreography that the lengths that he would go to create these scenes. He traveled to New Mexico just so that he could get a Model T car for these two individuals and this rustic rancher to serve as a model with his cigarette, as well as the young man with a tie that's about 3 years out of date. And you can see that there's the turn signal on the left-hand side. Maybe it's been cropped too much. The dog is saying, I don't want you to go. This is at a time for a painting that was started in Arlington and finished in Stockbridge. And his 3 sons had left. His oldest son had gone off to the Air Force, enlisted, and his 2 younger sons were in boarding schools, and so he was feeling rather remiss. Let's go to the next one. Here we are with FDR. How are we doing on time here? Good, good. Franklin Delano, let's review a little bit very quickly about World War II. 1939, what's going on? Germany had invaded Poland. 1940, England declared war. Europe is completely a disaster. England, in January of 1941, Roosevelt had the very difficult diplomatic task of convincing the very conservative Midwest, as well as many other conservatives in America, who did not want to enter into World War II. They were called isolationists. And there was a secret meeting off the coast of Newfoundland in August 9th, in which he met with Churchill. And they developed sort of a Bill of Rights for everybody throughout the world. And it worked off of this speech that Roosevelt gave on January 6, 1941, in which he said there should be freedom from want. And he kept saying, all throughout the world. Freedom of speech, all throughout the world. Freedom to practice your religion, all throughout the world. And then, what was the fourth one? Freedom of fear. So that was built into the Atlantic Charter. The isolationists were ballistic. They said, how could Roosevelt do this? Okay, 5 months pass. What happens on December 7th, 1941? Japan bombs Honolulu. There's a declaration of war, and so the whole thing turns around. It's quite different. As a result of that, Norman Rockwell started to make, let's go to the next one. Before I go to the next one, which are going to be images of Willie Gillis, I wanted to say that an additional difficulty that Norman Rockwell had is that America was coming off of a depression. So the crash on October 29, 1929, led to pretty much of a depression for 10 years, and the U.S. was just coming out of this. And 1933, Roosevelt was elected into office, the first of his 4 terms, and creating the New Deal. So you can imagine the domestic as well as international difficulty facing an individual like Roosevelt. So our exhibition basically tells a great deal of the story with videos as well as other didactic materials. For example, here is how one of our graphic designers had shown, in fact, when we do this, we have to edit not only the section labels, the extended labels, but we also have to edit the graphics and how it's going to look in terms of the size of an individual walking across in the exhibition itself. So let's go to the next one. 11 covers were dedicated to Willie Gillis. 11 covers. And what it did is it took this individual from early on as a private in the Army, from entering into boot camp and eventually coming out and showing him after the war, eventually entering into college with the GI Bill. It was a complete fiction. There was no Willie Gillis. In fact, the model had changed during his lifetime. So let's go on to the next. This shows you 3 examples. One we'd seen on the far side of taking a package that's coming from home. These were done in 41 and 42. Willie on the far side here in church. And then with a convoy, the image in the middle was never published on a cover in the Saturday Evening Post. Let's go to the next. This is the first one, freedom of speech. And if you look at the blackboard, behind the individual on the far side, on the viewer's left-hand side, right at the corner is Norman Rockwell, where he's looking up, and everybody else is looking up at this apple-throated young man who got up at the town meeting and said, I know you all want to get a brand new high school for Arlington, Vermont, but I'm not going to vote for it. But the interesting, and the reason why I think the Denver Art Museum had cast this exhibition in Denver this coming summer is because what? We have our national political conventions. And isn't this interesting that Rockwell's talking about civic discourse? That somebody was allowed the freedom to say something that everybody else said no, and that nobody would call him anything. They're all sort of pleasantly listening to him, saying, okay, fine, you've got your... And everybody has their blue ballot in hand, which would outline what the bond issue was. And on the near side, on the right-hand side, is a study. He went through 4 different studies for this painting. And he suffered greatly. There were, when he went, he was rebuffed by the Office of the War Department. And they said, no, Norman, we want real artists to do these 4 freedoms. I'm sorry, you know. Last time, World War I, illustrators did it. Now we're using artists, such as Ben Shahn. Well, okay, Ben Shahn's a great artist. He's really quite wonderful, but he's not going to be able to speak to millions like Norman Rockwell did. So this was his first study. It's at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Let's go to the next one. This is freedom from fear. And the parents are not so much tucking the children in bed. They're asleep already. They're just coming up to look at them. And he's holding on to the newspaper with the Burlington newspaper, which shows that there's blitz bombing in London. So everybody across the world should have that ability to be bereft of fear. Let's go to the next. And probably the most famous one, which is freedom from want. Now, these were actually published in every 2 weeks from February 7th and through to mid-March. And they weren't published on the cover. Why? Because you could actually tear it out and you could frame it. Now, after these were published in the Saturday Evening Post, they received over 25,000 letters asking if they could have duplicates of this. So the Post published this and disseminated 25,000, and shortly later, the Office of War Information published 2,500,000 copies that were sent all across America. His wife is the young woman, the brunette, on the right-hand side, and the woman in the left-hand side is his mother, Nancy. It's the only portrait he ever did of his mother. And this is and the communists, by the way, when this was disseminated in communist Russia, they said, look at these decadent Americans with wastefulness in this large dinner. Okay, let's go to the next. And then freedom of religion. Freedom of religion to worship in any way. He first started it in a barbershop. And so an Orthodox Jew was being shaved with a Protestant and maybe a Catholic in the background, but he said, no, this isn't going to be proper, and so he changed it over here to, and he secretly was able to include 2 blacks, 2 people of color, which was against the rule of the Saturday Evening Post. You couldn't have people of color on the cover of the magazine, but he was able to get through. The woman, the Catholic who's holding on to the rosary, she turned to him. She was from the town, and she turned to him and said, Norman, I'm sorry, I can't hold a rosary, I'm an Episcopalian. And he said, can't you just be a Catholic for an hour? So we've got this. And the phrase, according to one's own conscience, is actually from Joseph B. Smith of the Mormons, of the 13 Articles of Religion. So, you know, it's really quite fascinating. Let's go to the next. So it's also, we know that these were among the most parodied of works of art. And yet, if we go to the next, did you know that the New Yorker said that these are probably the most memorable of any of the American canon? Collectively, just about everybody across America knows what those 4 images are about, but not everybody knows what they did. For example, the Treasury Department of the War Department said, why don't we take these on a tour to, let's go to the next one. And after they were published, and that's how they look on the vertical column, but they were actually put on a railroad car and traveled to 16 cities across America. In fact, 76 years ago, almost to the date of the opening of our exhibition, the 4 Freedoms were in Denver. So they're coming back for the first time in 76 years for everybody to see in their glory. Now, when they traveled all across America, there were parades, there was great script in newspapers, there was great fanfare all across America, events. Norman went in Washington, Rockefeller Center, and then after the first or second tour decided that no, he would not follow through. But it raised $132 million, which in today's money is roughly 1.9 or 2.2 billion dollars for the war effort. So talk about the power of art. You've got the power of art. And if you bought a bond, you got to go into the train and see the exhibition. Now, they just weren't the 4 Freedoms. There were other kinds of posters which were against European Axis propaganda, but it was a winning event all across America, and this took place in 1943. When he was given the commission, the editor said, I want them finished in 2 months. He almost had a nervous breakdown. It took him about 7 months to finally finish all 4 Freedoms. Let's go to the next. This shows you our graphics, how we're going to show the tour of the tour that took place of the 4 Freedoms paintings. Let's go to the next. This gives you an image of the events that took place. Here's Norman signing posters. People have actually come up to me and said, I still have the original Saturday Evening Post packet of the original 4. Let's go to the next. Gives you an idea. The next one. And then subsequently other paintings which will be in the exhibition, such as this one, in which he understood that the lowliest of any kind of GI would be peeling potatoes. And what a change of situation in which this soldier is having a great time with his mom, home from the war, and that just shows you the photograph of how careful he would to take his settings, to put them into compositions. Let's go to the next one. Now, when he stopped publishing in the Denver Post, he went to Look magazine, and they allowed for other kinds of subjects. And this one is particularly interesting because it took place 4 years after the event. November 14th, 1960 is when Ruby Bridges was this young black girl who was the first to go into desegregate a school in New Orleans. And everybody in her classroom decided that they would go to another school. So she was actually tutored by somebody from New England who was a volunteer teacher, so she was actually lucky. She had one-to-one tutor. And so here, this is not how it actually took place, but what Rockwell did is that he took a number of news photographs, and then he also choreographed a number of individuals. And isn't it interesting that she's the only one who shows up completely. He didn't show the heads of the marshals. He shows their fists closed, which shows perhaps the tension. And he had two young girls in the community come and model for him. They were twins, and he took one of the two, and he had a special dress made just for Ruby Bridges. Let's go to the next. And this just shows you how he had shown the photographer how he wanted to have their steps indicated. And then he would use these photographs to rearrange into the composition of the picture. Let's go to the next. And then he went to social issues such as these massacres that took place of 3 civil rights individuals in 1965 in Mississippi. And he used his son Jarvis in the middle photograph as a model for this. And the shadows on the far side are of the Ku Klux Klan about to have this murder take place. Let's go to the next. And here we are back at the very beginning, and we're close to the moment when you can ask questions for all of us. But please come to the Denver Art Museum's exhibit. There is tons more than my little sampler tonight, but I hope you enjoyed my brief introduction to Norman Rockwell.
Well, Timothy, that was wonderful.
Well,
thank you so much. I'm gonna give you a softball to start with. Okay,
I'm gonna grab some water while you give me that softball. I don't have a mitt.
You've mentioned it a few times, and this is maybe Art 101, but can you distinguish the difference between an illustrator and an artist?
Oh, isn't that a good question?
Well, thank you.
Yeah. It's a good question that I can't answer because he blurs the boundaries, and I think we'd have to look at the entire corpus of Norman Rockwell's works. And I don't think that he was an artist all the time. I think he was an illustrator in which it becomes a little bit saccharine, a little bit sweet, and maybe it's kind of like pornography. You know it, you don't have to articulate it, And it's the same thing between his illustrations as against the things that he really did master and put into, in which we would say he's an incredible artist.
So I'd like to go back to something you mentioned, but I'm wondering if you could expand on it just a little bit, and that's why now? Why is the Denver Art Museum doing this exhibit now?
Well, I think I mentioned a little bit. I think it's about civic discourse. Institutions like the Denver Art Museum have a programming committee, and it's about 9 of us that meet together, and we talk about future exhibitions. And I really pitched for this, and some of my colleagues did as well, and some colleagues were a little bit apprehensive as well. So I'll get to that in a second. He appeals to such a broad base of individuals, and we can simply understand common courtesies. We can understand emotions. We can understand, we can have empathy in his images. And I think that goes back to your first question, how do we distinguish between an illustrator and an artist? And when he really does touch upon all of our empathetic abilities to feel for each other, that's when he's at his best. And I thought with the political conventions taking place this summer, and also a way to bridge the gap between the boomers and the millennials. I mean, a lot of millennials aren't going to know about Norman Rockwell, and this is a great introduction to Norman Rockwell to a broader base, and especially in light of his practice of photorealism and using those kind of techniques as a sketchbook prior to his paintings. Hope that answered some of it.
It did, and it makes me think of something else also, and I'm paraphrasing, but Norman Rockwell at some point said he didn't want to paint evil people. And
correct.
And I'm thinking about one of the last images you showed where his son Jarvis is the model holding another man,
sure.
and it's only the shadows
only
of the KKK
shadows. Not the individuals.
So did he stick with that pledge really through all of his art?
For my past 2 years of reading everything on Norman Rockwell, yes, as far as I know, yeah. Well, yeah. You don't see that. He was a hugely complex individual, and the 2 biographies that I looked at, mostly Deborah Solomon, she really brings out a number of aspects that maybe Norman Rockwell's fans don't want to know about. For example, his predilection towards preference for traveling with men, possibly his homosexuality. We don't really know about that. Her readings of a number of paintings are really quite astonishing, which is perfectly fine. I'm willing to accept that everybody has stories to tell about images, including his. He's fascinating, absolutely fascinating. And there's going to be events this coming summer in which we will have speakers at the Denver Art Museum, of a curator from the Norman Rockwell Museum, an historian who talked about the context for the 4 freedoms, as well as Abigail Rockwell is going to be interviewed by me.
Oh, that's exciting.
So stay tuned.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, you mentioned his traveling, and my understanding is that he loved to go to Europe and went to Europe a number of times.
Well, okay. He's in Vermont. Family Circle magazine comes to do a big interview, and where is Norman when it's published? He's in Alhambra and outside of Los Angeles golfing. So he spent a great deal of time in Europe. going frequently by himself, and also traveling to California by himself as well. And then linking up with Hollywood types. But I think, and it depended on the demeanor of his significant others, his wives. And it was interesting that he was this lone soul who wanted to be in his studio almost all the time. And maybe it was his third wife, Molly, who finally understood, this is what Norman's all about. I accept Norman. His first wife didn't. His second wife had a very difficult time with abuse, substance abuse.
But you mentioned, this travel to Europe. Where do we see that in his painting, or don't we?
We don't. In fact, he went to Europe for, I think, in 29 or 30. By the way, he was very conservative with his investments, didn't lose anything in the crash. Went to Europe to become an artist for 6 months. Went to Paris, stayed and had various studios throughout the city, and but never jumped over that. In fact, he never said he was an artist. He always said, I'm an illustrator. And he wanted to be the best illustrator that he could be.
He, for a guy born in the 19th century, had a pretty long life and painted for 65 plus years of that life.
Correct.
Would you say, I think we can agree that he captured a lot of American history during that period of time, but would you also say that he perhaps influenced it at times?
In what way?
Well, I'm thinking in particular of the look period, where he's maybe going out a little bit edgier than he had been in previous decades.
Wasn't it amazing that, Look in life, but especially Look, had rather racy photographs and cutting photography, even more than Life. As a young man, we couldn't get Life and Look because they were so racy. We could only get the Saturday Evening Post. But isn't it amazing that they allowed him to put this in the magazine? They weren't necessarily on the covers, but they gave him the freedom to make us think about what's going on across the nation.
I want to talk about something else.
I mean, who else would be doing that today? What artist would be doing that today?
Banksy, perhaps?
Banksy, yes, absolutely. I was recently in Palestine and in Bethlehem, and there's Banksy frescoes, as it were, murals, which makes you think about where you are in no uncertain terms. So, I mean, maybe he's the Norman Rockwell of our age.
Well, going back to Norman, and one of the things that it's a theme that I think comes out in many of his paintings, and that's this juxtaposition of age and youth. Now, there's some obvious things we could say about that, but what are maybe some of the other things that you read into that juxtaposition? I'm thinking of the painting Breaking Away, which is amazing. This older father, his son going off to college.
But the irony about Rockwell is that he was so lonely himself, and maybe the only way that he could manifest his feelings is by showing something so emotional. I mean, the feelings in that painting are so authentic and genuine, of that father who's just absolutely distraught that his young nubile son's heading off to college, clueless, absolutely clueless, and he's, his head is cocked, waiting for the train, doesn't even know it's taking place. Maybe that's wonderful. He's recognizing that it's good that he's so innocent, that had he known what he was going to experience going forward in college, but that's part of maybe human nature, is that aged individuals have so much wisdom about world experiences. And how is it that Rockwell keyed in on this? I'm trying to remember if he was a great reader. I think maybe not that much. He just wanted to be in his studio as much as possible and choreograph. And one thing I didn't mention in my talk, and which people don't know about, is that he would go into a dark room, not a photographic dark room. He would simply, from about 8 to 10 or 11 o'clock at night, he would go into a room until he came up with that composition that he wanted to achieve.
Well, I want to tie back into his art and his personal history, and that is his relationship with his parents. My understanding is that he didn't have a close relationship with his parents.
Absolutely not.
And yet that theme of family is so prominent in his art.
But aren't these interesting contradictions? You know, when his brother died in Florida, he said, he just wrote in his journal, Jarvis passed away today. Didn't go down to his funeral, didn't have any close relationship with his brother. May have been jealous. His brother was a rather athletic, brawny type who had made a lot of money early in his career as a stockbroker and then lost a great deal. And then slim, lean Norman at one time weighed 145, and his last years he was down to 115. And then his brother got engaged, and Norman said, I'm going to get engaged, and did almost 2 weeks later after they announced their engagement with his first wife, Irene. Isn't it interesting that we all want to read something about the personality in works of art? And I'm always hesitant to do that. I don't write art history like that, but some people are very good at it, and which makes it interesting reading to tell these kind of stories.
Going back to the four freedoms themselves, and in particular the speech, Norman Rockwell wasn't the only artist, right, that was doing art around these themes, and yet his seemed to be the enduring works of art from this period.
Isn't that the truth? There were some artists who actually had depicted medieval scenes as if they were crusaders that went over like a lead balloon. And look at the communications department in Franklin Delano Roosevelt. They basically told him and said, it's a flop. It's a complete flop. You've got to communicate these Bill of Rights as it were in some other way. And Roosevelt was absolutely thrilled at what Rockwell had done. But of course, the mechanizations of how he had to do that, because when he went to Washington, he was sent from office to office to office. And there was a big debate whether he went by himself or whether he was invited by the Office of War Information. So that's a big question which I'm going to ask Abigail. The other thing about it is that after he produced those, I mean, they're universal, they're timely. And they did such a magnificent job of speaking about the need for these four basic elements.
And why do you think they resonated with the American public the way they did?
Because I think people could see themselves in those images.
Now those were paired
Little
with...
House on the Prairie, right?
Okay.
Leave It to Beaver. Bonanza. Okay, I'm giving television shows which I grew up with, which we were all allowed to watch. We couldn't watch The Untouchables; it was too racy. But these were things that resonated with people, and they still do, don't you think?
Absolutely. I want to return to the particular painting that you spent some time on, which was freedom of speech, because I'm so glad you pointed out the backstory on that was an actual town meeting that Rockwell had attended, and that individual stood up and said something that nobody agreed with, but everybody heard him out. Now,
They didn't shout. They didn't shout him down.
No.
They didn't mock him. But these were kind of New England values that Rockwell picked up on. And remember, he wasn't from New England. He was a New Yorker.
He was a New Yorker, yep.
New Yorker, New York City, New Rochelle, and then up to Vermont, and then down to Stockbridge.
But doesn't that suggest a broadening of the concept of freedom of speech? Because usually when we think of it, we think of newspapers and magazines or somebody on television. This is a person in your town.
Well, imagine, we might even have presidential debates like that event of freedom of speech, where you're not interrupted, where you can actually, I mean, we don't have to have Joe Biden say, well, here's the point, and then being shouted down by another individual of the other party. So it's civic discourse.
Yeah.
And that was the only painting that was based on an actual event. The other three were just simply conjured up from his imagination. In fact, he woke up at 2 a.m. and got out of bed, ran across the street to another artist, another illustrator, and said, I got it, I finally got it, and they went down to Washington. Now, what's interesting, 7 months passed. They went down, I think, in May, they were back in June, and in September, December, they were finished, and then what happened, his entire studio burned.
Oh, that's right.
All the preliminary material that went into the Four Freedoms up in flames. Really sad. And in fact, what he did then is he did a really interesting little cartoon illustration about that event, maybe as therapy for himself, saying, my God, look at everything that had gone away.
Now, his subsequent studio is preserved to this day. I think,
in Stockbridge.
Yes.
In Stockbridge, yes.
And that was important to him. It's not something that his foundation or his family did after.
Correct.
He set that up before he died.
With Molly, and I think Molly was a great partner at the end with him. And keep in mind that he had a dealer in New York City who put on a show, I think in 68, 69. It was right around the corner, in fact, from Leo Castelli's gallery, and Leo Castelli was the great dealer for pop art. And Warhol, in fact, bought 2 works by Norman Rockwell. And such personalities as David Bowie, towards the end, said, I want you to do my portrait. Frank Sinatra had his portrait painted. Arnold Palmer had his portrait painted. And he did this portrait of Richard Nixon when Nixon was elected. And Nixon rebuffed him. He didn't meet with him. He was sent down by Look magazine to do the portrait, and Nixon had him waiting at the Pierre Hotel in his anteroom and never saw him. So for Nixon's portrait, the bust is some other individual, and the portrait is from photographs. And normally Rockwell would give the portrait to the president, but this is the one case in which he didn't give the portrait to the president. And eventually the National Portrait Gallery in Washington, part of the Smithsonian, purchased it.
But he didn't really love doing portraits, did he?
No, I think the reason why he accepted it during the last part of his life is to keep him busy. I mean, keep in mind the last 6 years he was suffering possibly from Alzheimer's or possibly from mild dementia. In fact, a telling story is that right before he died, he was wheeled into his studio. Everything's tidy. He was rather obsessive about keeping everything clean. He's the kind of guy who would go backpacking and he'd polish his shoes to go backpacking. Anyway, he's in his studio, in his wheelchair, and he blurts out to his wife and says, "But I want to be in my studio." What a dear way to kind of finish a biography on Rockwell.
Yeah. Now, do we know very much about what he thought of the essays that accompanied his images in the Saturday Evening Post?
There were 4 essayists, you're right. Booth Tarkington, Stephen Vincent Benet, Carlos Bouleros, and
Will Durant.
Will Durant. I don't think he read them.
Well, it's interesting.
I mean, but they probably had some premonition about what he was dealing with, and they were supposed to tie in together. But the editor noticed that they didn't on all 4 occasions.
Well, I thought Booth Tarkington, for instance, who did freedom of speech, his really had nothing at all to do with, his was actually a parable, 2 individuals talking, and I'm not going to spoil it for people who want to go out and read it, but it's 2 individuals talking in the Alps somewhere. Right. But the one that I thought really did tie in was Stephen Vincent Benet's on freedom from fear. He started talking about how, and this was almost 100 years before this became common parlance, and that's the term globalization. He talked about how once the Wright brothers' plane lifted off at Kitty Hawk, the world shrunk.
Right.
And I thought, my gosh, that was so prescient for him at that time. Of course, he had no idea. He died the day, obviously, as you probably know, that essay was published.
Right.
But the other thing that he seemed to be getting at, which was isolationism and how wrong that was and how we weren't an island. And of course, we know that all too well right now, given our current circumstances.
Right.
But I also thought that Rockwell subtly captured that in the newspaper the father was holding. And certainly their scene at that moment was idyllic and peaceful, but he's holding this newspaper showing that in other parts of the world, it's not idyllic and peaceful.
And therefore, we can't be isolationists.
Exactly.
Right. I mean, no man is an island. So, but isn't it great that we get to have this discourse now? And that everybody out there watching this should have this discourse as well. Do we have any questions?
Well, I've been checking, and we've been getting a lot of kudos.
Oh, my goodness.
But I'm not actually seeing
everybody
some
out
questions
there laughed
right
at all
now.
my jokes.
You also mentioned something about few people had seen originals of his work.
Imagine that.
And I had heard another biographer talk about how he didn't necessarily value them, and they'd wind up in a pile in his studio. And if somebody stopped by and said, "Hey, could I have that picture you did on this or that?" he'd give them away.
The dealer who came down in his Bentley, he called it Ming Blue. Isn't that wonderful? For color. In his Bentley. He's in Stockbridge, Red Lion Inn, calls up Norman, "Can we come over?" Yes, he comes over. He looks at this painting and he said, "Here, I'll pay you $2,500 for it." And Rockwell says, "No, take it. I've already been paid for it from the Saturday Evening Post. Take it, please." And so they went on this kind of exchange. He wasn't very good financially with his affairs, but he certainly didn't suffer either towards the end. But the interesting thing about it, and towards the end, he had to close his blinds because too many people were coming by to Stockbridge, because they put up this small museum for an historic home, and he lent about 40 paintings to that before they eventually built the Norman Rockwell Museum in Stockbridge. And too many people were knocking on his door asking for autographs and things like that. But I think it's amazing irony that millions had seen his images and so few people had actually seen the originals. But now you've got the opportunity in Denver for 12 weeks to see them. So take advantage of that, coming to the Denver Art Museum to see the Four Freedoms as well as many, many other paintings. There's about 36 works by Norman Rockwell. There's a section on the history of illustration, Leyendecker, and others. Then there's wonderful little snippets of FDR giving his talk. There's one in which there's an explanation about his working techniques. So it's really an incredibly rich exhibition, which we do so well at the Denver Art Museum. Not because of me, I'm just the Tom Sawyer. Come and plan my exhibition with me. And my colleagues and team members are absolutely incredible.
Well, it sounds wonderful. I do have a question related back to FDR himself, and is that, did Rockwell ever meet with President Roosevelt?
You stumped me.
Finally, I've been trying, and yes.
I don't think so.
Okay.
I don't think so because I know FDR wrote him a letter. So if he wrote him a letter, okay, fine, he could have written a letter, but I don't think, not in my reading, that didn't ring a bell that he had spent time with him. He had with other presidents.
We've talked a little bit about some of the elements in Rockwell's work. I want to go back to something, because you just reminded me of it when you were talking about that Ming blue Bentley.
Yes.
And that's the dress that Ruby Bridges wore in that image that Rockwell had. You had mentioned he purposely had that dress made for her.
The white one.
And it's stark white. Talk to us about the importance of why that little girl's dress was white.
Personally, I would simply posit that it was innocence. I mean, and Johnson had just enacted the Civil Rights Act. I mean, which was an incredible political feat. Imagine that. Can I just do a little excursus? I think everybody should read Robert Caro, as it's pronounced in New York, his book called Working. And it's the most incredible non-memoir memoir, because he talks about the achievements of Lyndon Baines Johnson with the Civil Rights Act and how that was passed. But it's also interesting that it was 4 years after that event took place. So even though things had happened, were they really changing? And maybe not. And so he wanted to make something as meaningful as possible to hit the heart of us and say, let's think about what is now law and how much we're putting actions to that law.
It seems like perhaps what you're saying is Rockwell produced the right art for the right time.
Absolutely. Like Bansky today.
And so this exhibit opens on
May 2nd.
May 2nd and runs through
August 23rd.
Is this the kind of exhibit people will need to get tickets for in advance?
I don't think it's ticketed, but check our website to see. I should probably know that, but I'll know that by my next lecture.
Do you all take a day off, or is the museum open every day?
The museum is now open 7 days a week.
Okay, that's wonderful.
Sadly, we're closed until the 1st of the month of April because of circumstances from COVID-19, but I'm sure things will improve shortly. But I'm so supportive of the Vail Symposium, plural and single, and I hope everybody viewing this is equally as supportive as I am.
Timothy, thank you so much for making the drive up here and honoring this commitment in a different format, but I think we still reached a lot of people.
I hope we did. Thank you.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
And thank you for joining the Vail Symposium this evening. Unfortunately, we have had to cancel our next two programs. Scott Pelley of 60 Minutes and Robert Einhorn, who's a specialist in nuclear nonproliferation and nuclear treaties. We are working with both speakers to reschedule those events. And we'll apprise you of the remaining events in our series through email. So again, thank you for joining the Vail Symposium this evening, and good night.